Hello everyone and welcome back to RPG PhD, the channel where we dig into the theory and practice of tabletop role-playing games. I'm Dr. Ben and today we're diving into a topic that shaped nearly every tabletop role-playing game table out there, whether we realize it or not. We're talking about the evolution of the Game Master. From the all-knowing storyteller behind the screen to a co-creative facilitator shaping stories with the group, the role of the Game Master has undergone some major changes over the years. So if you've ever wondered why modern Game Masters are encouraged to say yes and more than you can't do that, or why player agency has become a core design focus in so many new systems, then stick around. We're going to trace the arc of this transformation through the games, the cultures, and the playstyles that brought us here. In the early days of tabletop role-playing games, the Game Master was often seen as the all-powerful storyteller, the architect of the world and narrative in which players were merely adventurers. Over time, however, expectations for the Game Master's role have shifted dramatically. Modern game designs increasingly cast the Game Master not as an omnipotent narrator, but as a facilitator of collaborative storytelling. Players today enjoy far more agency in shaping the story than the dungeon delvers of the 1970s. This video traces the evolution of GM authority across the decades, from the traditional Game Master-centric origins, think early Dungeons & Dragons, to the rise of shared narrative and player-driven mechanics in contemporary games. Along the way, we'll highlight key designers and theorists, Edwards, Laws, Height, and others, who question the old paradigms, and we'll examine concrete examples of game mechanics that redistributed power at the table, such as player-facing moves, clocks, and many more. In reflecting on these changes, we can begin to imagine what the future of GMing and player empowerment might hold. In the beginning, the Dungeon Master or Game Master was king, or as D&D co-creator Gygax put it, the shaper of the cosmos for the game world. In the 1970s and early 80s, games like Dungeons & Dragons firmly established the Dungeon Master as the ultimate authority. The Game Master created the adventure, controlled all the non-player characters and monsters, and was the final arbiter of the rules. In fact, the golden rule in early D&D was explicitly that the Dungeon Master is the final arbiter in their game. What they say is what goes. Players were expected to follow the Game Master's lead. If they disagreed, the Game Master might hear them out, but ultimately the Game Master's word was law. This was an era of high Game Master control. If the Game Master said an ogre appears, an ogre appeared. And if the Game Master said a bridge collapsed, it collapsed, no matter what the players might wish. It's important to note that this early model was inherited from both literary tradition, the Game Master as a storyteller or narrator of a fantasy saga, and from war games, the Game Master as a neutral referee who arbitrates the rules. In original D&D and its immediate successors, you can see both aspects. Gygax's Keep on the Borderlands module famously encourages the Dungeon Master to be creative and dramatic. It is you who will give form and content to all the universe. Each player can only perform within the bounds you will set. This was underscoring the Game Master's storytelling responsibility. At the same time, early Game Masters were also referees of unpredictable player choices. The rules were often lighter, not always, and served more as guidelines, meaning Game Masters had to improvise rulings frequently. An old-school Game Master might not have a rule for every situation, but they had authority to decide on the spot what happened when a player tried something clever or innovative. This rulings over rules mindset has seen a modern resurgence in the old-school revival, or the old-school renaissance, the OSR movement. OSR games emulate the style of 1970s D&D, bringing back the Game Master as a neutral referee who presents challenges and judges outcomes without a predetermined story. The primer for old-school gaming captures this approach. Most of the time in old-style gaming, you don't use a rule, you make a ruling. The players can describe any action. The referee uses common sense to decide what happens. Rules are a resource for the referee, not for the players. Players use observation and description as their tools. Rules are for the referee only. In other words, in an OSR game, the players have freedom to attempt anything, but it's understood that the game master will decide how those attempts play out, often by calling for a die roll or simply by narrative logic. The agency of players in this context lies in their creative problem solving and choices in the world. The game master does not typically force a plot on them, but the game master does control the world's responses and the interpretation of rules. Thus, in traditional and OSR play, the game master's power is immense, but used in a particular way. The game master sets up situations, then referees what the players do. There may not be a story beforehand, especially in OSR sandboxes, where the idea is that story emerges from play. But the game master is certainly not handing over narrative control. The dynamic is sometimes likened to the game master being the simulation engine or impartial judge. If the players wander into the deadly swamp of doom, it's the game master's job to play fair and let chips fall where they may, even if that means character death, rather than to fudge outcomes. Player agency in early games meant you can try anything in character, but the game master will tell you what happens. This era also saw the trope of the adversarial game master in some circles, running lethal dungeons like the infamous Tomb of Horrors, where it felt like game master versus players. While not all early game masters were adversarial, the culture did sometimes frame it as the game master setting challenges and the players trying to beat them. The best early game masters, however, were often described as those who were fair and engaging storytellers even within these constraints. By the late 80s, many games and supplements started offering advice for game masters on how to be entertaining and fair, not just omnipotent. Still, the fundamental expectation remained. The game master was the storyteller, referee with nearly total power over the game world. As RPGs gained complexity and narrative ambition in the 1980s and the 1990s, many games shifted toward a game master as author model. Instead of purely running a world simulation, game masters were now often encouraged to craft stories or plot arcs for the players to experience. A major influence here was White Wolf's World of Darkness games, like Vampire the Masquerade, first released in 1991, which explicitly called the game master the storyteller. In these games, emphasis was placed on dramatic narratives, character backstories, and overarching plots. Published adventures and homebrew chronicles alike often had a predetermined sequence of events, or at least a desired outcome, which the game master was supposed to guide the players toward. This approach could yield very thematic, emotionally resonant games, but it also introduced the problem of railroading. Railroading is the term for when a game master forces the players down a specific path or outcome, negating their meaningful choices. Game designer and theorist Ron Edwards later dubbed this style story before, meaning the story or plot is largely decided before play by the game master. Classic story before symptoms might include the game master having a predetermined ending. You will all sacrifice yourselves heroically to save the kingdom. Or predetermined encounters in a sequence, and if players try to deviate, the game master subtly, or not so subtly, pushes them back on track. As Robin D. Laws Riley noted, we all believe that players should have meaningful choices, although we decry gaming stories that can't go in multiple directions, and you often also hear game masters wondering how to keep players on track. This captures the core tension of the era, how to reconcile the player's freedom with the game master's plotted narrative. Many gaming groups informally negotiated this tension. Some embraced participationist, essentially an agreement that the game master has a story and the players will go along to create a satisfying tale. In return, the game master ensures everyone's character has cool moments in that story. Others fell into illusionism, where the game master maintains an illusion of player choice while secretly adjusting the plot in the background to reach the planned outcomes. For example, a game master might have two doors in a dungeon. Behind one is the next important encounter, and behind the other, it's empty. But whichever door the players choose, the game master makes that the encounter door, ensuring that the story stays on course. This is a false choice technique, and some players were fine with it, while others felt cheated if they discovered it. Robin Laws characterized such approaches as false choices that only give the feeling of agency but not the reality. Because of these issues, game design and game master advice in the 90s started emphasizing ways to maintain narrative flow without stifling player agency. Robin Laws, in his influential Robin's Laws of Good Game Mastering from 2001, advised game masters to pay attention to player desires. Some players want combat, some want story, some want problem solving, and to improvise within a narrative framework rather than stick rigidly to a script. He championed the idea that players' choices should significantly impact the story's direction, and that if players surprise the game master should roll with it creatively, rather than steer them back by force. In one of his design essays, Laws tackles the eternal tension between game master-driven and player-driven narrative, acknowledging that too much control in either direction can be problematic, and a balance must be struck. Another innovation addressing these problems came from game mechanics, particularly in the investigative role-playing game genre. Designer Kenneth Haidt, working with Robin Laws on the GUMSHOE system, the Esoterrorist Trail of Cthulhu, helped eliminate a common point of game master over control, clue finding. In a classic mystery scenario, if players failed a die roll to find a crucial clue, the plot could grind to a halt, forcing the game master to fudge or force the clue's discovery anyway. GUMSHOE's philosophy was, the premise is that investigative games are not about finding clues, they're about interpreting the clues that are found. Thus, the rules ensure that players will always get core clues if they have the right skills and look in the right place. No die roll needed. This takes away the game master's ability or temptation to withhold information arbitrarily. The story proceeds on the player's success at figuring out what clues mean rather than on the game master guarding the information gates. Haidt often emphasizes that the fun is in what players do with information, not in the game master keeping secrets. This marks a subtle shift of power. The investigation part of the story becomes player-driven. They get the clues and decide what theories to pursue, while the game master's role moves toward presenting interesting interpretations and challenges around those clues, not simply deciding if the players find anything. Despite these advancements, many 90s games still fundamentally put the game master in the author's chair. Whether it was Call of Cthulhu modules with scripted mythos revelations, Shadowrun missions with preset objectives, or Vampire Chronicles with deep NPC-driven metaplots, the assumption was the game master would pre-write a storyline and the players would, to some extent, experience that story through their characters. The social contract often implied that players shouldn't stray too far from what the game master prepared. Some groups were perfectly happy with this, especially if the game master was a talented storyteller. After all, a thrilling narrative led by a game master can feel like being protagonist in a novel or movie, which is a big part of RPG appeal. However, by the late 90s, a growing segment of the role-playing game community started pushing back against the heavy top-down narrative approach. They asked questions like, what if the players had equal say in where the story goes? What if the game master didn't pre-plan the plot at all? These questions set the stage for an indie revolution in game design. In the early 2000s, a wave of independent role-playing game designers began actively challenging the traditional game master player power dynamic. At the forefront was Ron Edwards, co-founder of The Forge, a famous indie RPG design forum, who articulated a creative agenda called Story Now. In contrast to story before play, story now demands that narrative is created through play, in the moment, by the collaborative efforts of players and the game master, rather than pre-scripted by the GM. Edwards and other theorists argued that RPGs were a unique medium where players should be co-authors of the experience, not just audience to the game master's tale. He was also sharply critical of illusionism and heavy prep. His essays often pointed out that pre-plotted games can turn into an exploitative relationship with players, essentially reducing them to actors following the game master director's script. The Forge community encouraged designs that would mechanically enforce the sharing of narrative control and address of premise during play, not in advance. One of the first big indie games exemplifying this was Edwards' own Sorcerer from 2001. In Sorcerer, each player defines a kicker for their character, basically a starting situation or problem that is guaranteed to thrust the character into drama. The rule is that the game master must incorporate each player's kicker and play to find out how it resolves. There is no way to plan the story completely beforehand because it's driven by the kickers, which the players invented without knowing how they'll end. Sorcerer also introduced the idea of bangs, sudden events the game master throws in during play to force interesting choices. But crucially, the game master is instructed not to decide outcomes in advance. They create situations, not conclusions. All this was a radical reimagining of the game master's job, from authoring a plot to facilitating the evolution of a story from player input. Meanwhile, other indie designers were exploring similar territory with different mechanics. Vincent Baker's game Dogs in the Vineyard from 2004 put players in the role of quasi-Wild West religious lawgivers who travel from town to town confronting moral dilemmas. Here, the game master sets up an initial situation, a town with a problem, but it's entirely up to the players how to resolve it. Will they condemn a sinner, show mercy, uncover a deeper conspiracy? The system's conflict resolution uses raises and sees with dice, a bit like betting in poker, to escalate conflicts. What's interesting is that players can always choose to give, to lose a conflict, if they're not willing to up the stakes. This means the outcomes of showdowns are not solely at the game master discretion, or even die rolls. They depend on how far the player is willing to go in character. A player could decide, my dog backs down, this NPC gets what they want this time, effectively authoring a failure or change of direction because it's dramatically fitting or because the risk of continuing was too high. Dogs illustrated a new philosophy. The story's course can branch based on player moral choices, with mechanics backing that up, instead of one path being correct per the game master's plan. The game master in Dogs in the Vineyard still plays the world and NPCs, but doesn't pre-decide how the town's tale should end. That emerges from play, and the often surprising judgments that the players make. Burning Wheel, first published in 2002 by Luke Crane, is another landmark indie game that rethinks game master and player roles. It's a fantasy game, crunchy in mechanics, yet story-driven in play. The heart of Burning Wheel is its belief system. Players write 3 beliefs for their characters, which are statements of principles, goals, or driving ideals. Might makes right. I will seize power to protect my people. Or, my sister can be saved from the darkness within her. These beliefs effectively tell the game master what the story should be about. Luke Crane has said that when running Burning Wheel, his job as game master is to test the player's beliefs, to throw situations at them that force hard choices and dramatic conflict relevant to those beliefs. He's not there to drag them through a plot unrelated to their characters. This is a profound shift. The players, through their character beliefs, drive the narrative agenda, and the game master facilitates by presenting challenges and opportunities that tie into those agendas. Burning Wheel's mechanics even reward players with Artha points for playing in accordance with their beliefs or challenging them in meaningful ways. Crane describes it as ensuring you, the player, are going to do more than just roll dice. The mechanics let players know they are a meaningful part of this. In practice, a Burning Wheel campaign might have the game master sketch an opening scenario, but where it goes depends on which beliefs players pursue or alter. The story is a dialogue between player choices and game master consequences, not as a monologue by the GM. Alongside these design experiments came Game Master-less or Game Master-light games, which truly put narrative power in the hands of players. A standout example is Fiasco from 2009, a game explicitly inspired by darkly comedic crime films, and designed for zero prep and no GM. In Fiasco, all players collectively generate the scenario by picking relationships, needs, and objects from lists, thereby seeding the story of ambitious scoundrels and their imminent ruin. Play proceeds in scenes that players take turns setting, and everyone improvises to create a chain of calamities. There is no single authority steering the plot. The structure of the game itself provides the framework, with a tilt in the middle to throw a twist, and an aftermath table to determine how badly each character ends up. As one review put it, Fiasco's structure gives you the perfect framework to create your caper without the need for a narrator. The success of Fiasco, it even won awards and had an episode on the web show Tabletop with Will Wheaton, proved that RPGs can work and be wildly fun without any game master at all if the rules support the players in creating and resolving conflict collaboratively. Essentially, the system in Fiasco shares out the traditional game master tasks, scene framing, introducing complications, among the players in a structured way. Around the same time, games like Universalis explored everyone is the game master style with a token economy for adding to the fiction. And story-oriented LARPs and experimental games were also distributing the narrative authority in novel ways. The indie scene of the 2000s was incredibly vibrant with ideas about empowering players. Primetime Adventures gave players control over plot pacing via screen presence, and let them decide outcomes of conflicts if they had the high card. Polaris had no game master and instead ritualized narrative negotiation among players, and many more. Each of these took a different slice of the game master's traditional duties and handed it to the players or to explicit rules procedures. Interestingly, the mid-2000s also saw the birth of the OSR movement, as noted earlier, running in parallel to these narrative indie developments. On the surface, OSR games went back to basics with lethal dungeons and minimalist rules, which might seem a return to full GM control. But OSR play is actually its own kind of rebellion against scripted plots. In an OSR sandbox, the game master doesn't usually come with a story. They come with a map and encounter tables. The players decide where to go and what to do, and the game master reacts as a referee. Of course, there's a popular saying in OSR circles, the players plan, the GM plans, and the game laughs. In other words, nobody really knows what will happen. Emergent gameplay is the goal. This shares a spirit with Story Now, albeit without formal narrative sharing mechanics. The game master in an OSR game has vast authority to adjudicate outcomes, since rules are light, but is expected to be neutral and not predetermine outcomes or protect the players. If the party's plan leads to disaster, so be it. That becomes the story, tragic though it may be. So both the indie narrativist games and the OSR games were, in their own ways, reactions against the tightly scripted game master as author style. One by sharing authorship with players, the other by removing authored story entirely in favor of exploration and challenge. By the end of the early 2000s, the hobby had splintered into various design philosophies, but the overall trend was clear. Players were gaining more agency, and the role of the game master was moving away from boss and toward partner, or sometimes eliminated altogether. The stage was set for these ideas to enter the mainstream consciousness of RPGs in the 2010s. The 2010s saw a flowering of game designs that combined wide accessibility with the new principles of shared narrative. The poster child for this is Apocalypse World from 2010, a game whose influence cannot be overstated. Apocalypse World introduced a framework that has been adopted and adapted by dozens of other games. The Powered by the Apocalypse, or PBTA family. In these games, Baker explicitly instructs the game master, called the Master of Ceremonies, to facilitate, not dictate. The MC is given agendas and principles to follow, such as make Apocalypse World seem real, make the player characters' lives not boring, and play to find out what happens. That last principle, play to find out, is essentially a commandment against the old style of plotting. The MC is not supposed to decide outcomes in advance or force any particular storyline. Instead, the MC sets up interesting situations through threats called fronts, and then lets the story emerge through play. The official rulebook bluntly states, don't plan future scenes and don't decide what the story's going to be. You can't, don't even try. In one review summary, the author noted that this game forcefully tells game masters to refrain from prepping stories and adventures. Prep focuses on organizing the game's fronts, not plotting. This represented a turning point, a mainstream published RPG telling game masters not to prep a story was almost heresy to old hands at the time, but it resonated strongly with many players. Why did it resonate? Because Apocalypse World provided a reliable structure that made the game exciting and coherent without a pre-written plot. It shifted a lot of responsibility to the mechanics and the player's choices. A hallmark of these games is the concept of moves. Moves are specific triggers in the fiction that cause a dice roll and a particular range of outcomes. They're often phrased in the format of when X happens in the story, roll dice plus mechanics. On a 10 plus, do this. On a 7 to 9, do this. On a miss, 6 or below, do something else. Crucially, most moves are player-facing, meaning the player rolls the dice for their character's action, and the game master never rolls to oppose them. In fact, Apocalypse World's rules say the MC never rolls dice. Instead, when players roll low, a miss, the MC gets to make a hard move, essentially a game master controlled consequence or twist. Because of this structure, the narrative is a constant conversation back and forth. Players declare they're doing things, triggering moves. Dice outcomes then prompt either player successes, successes with complication, or outright game master complications. For example, if a player character tries to seduce an NPC in Apocalypse World and rolls a 6, a miss, the rules don't say you fail to seduce. They say the MC now can make as hard and direct a move as they like. Perhaps the NPC takes offense and pulls a knife, or reveals they were setting a trap all along. The key is the dice outcomes drive the story in unpredictable directions that neither player nor game master fully controls alone. The game master is facilitating this process, interpreting outcomes according to their principles. Maybe their principle is think off screen too, meaning consider what the NPC might have been planning behind the scenes. Another major innovation is how these games handle information and world building. They often involve players in creating setting details on the fly. In Apocalypse World, MC is told to ask provocative questions and build on the answers. In practice, during the first session, the MC might ask a player, your character is a mechanic. What's a really valuable piece of tech you've been trying to get your hands on? The player's answer becomes canon, and now the MC works it into the ongoing narrative. The Critical Hits review of Apocalypse World highlights that the world takes shape as the players flesh out their characters, while the MC peppers the discussion with questions. Just make it up. Create the world as the MC notes relevant details. Rather than arriving with a fully fleshed setting and story, the Apocalypse World Game Master co-creates the setting with the players in play, ensuring the players are invested and that their ideas drive the fiction. This approach has been likened to the Game Master being a facilitator or moderator of a brainstorming session, where they have final say to keep things coherent, but everyone contributes creative bits. The popularity of Apocalypse World led to an explosion of Powered by the Apocalypse games across genres. from Dungeon World, which is fantasy, to Monster Hearts, which is supernatural teen drama, to Apocalypse World's official follow-up, Monster of the Week, which is more of a supernatural investigation, and many more. All these games reinforce the concept of the game master as referee of the fiction and a fan of the characters, rather than the source of all plot. Dungeon World, for instance, encourages the game master to draw maps but leave blanks for players to fill in, and to use failure outcomes to introduce twists that players will find interesting, not just punitive. It also directly imports the idea, be a fan of the player's characters, meaning the game master should want to see the PCs do awesome things, even when challenging them, not relish in their defeat. This ethos is a far cry from the old adversarial stance. It positions the game master as a facilitator of cool moments and guardian of fairness, ensuring everyone's contributions shine. Another hugely influential design from the 2010s is Blades in the Dark. Blades took some inspiration from Powered by the Apocalypse, but involved it in a new direction, suitable for a game about daring scoundrels and heists in a haunted industrial city. In Blades, the game master still runs the world, but almost every aspect of action resolution is a conversation with the players. A signature element is the position and effect system. When a player says what they want their character to do, the game master sets a position, controlled, risky, or desperate, and an effect level, limited, standard, or great, based on the situation. But this is often done through discussion. The game master might say, that sounds desperate with a standard effect, and the player can negotiate or propose a different approach to get a better outcome. The text explains that the game master establishes the position and effect level of the action. The choice of position and effect is influenced strongly by the player's choice of action. The players are encouraged to be creative and clever to improve their odds, and the game master listens to their reasoning. For example, if a player wants to consort with a contact to get info rather than wreck the door down, the game master might agree that's controlled position. Pretty safe, but limited effect. You won't get much info. The player then can decide which way to go. This back and forth makes planning and actions a collaborative, tactical discussion rather than the game master unilaterally declaring difficulty. Once the action is rolled in Blades, the results follow a principle similar to Powered by the Apocalypses. On a full success, the player gets what they want. On a mixed result, they succeed, but there's a consequence. On a bad result, things go awry. What's notable is that Blades formalizes consequences and how to handle them. It uses things like progress clocks to represent dangers or projects ticking toward completion. If a player fails, the game master might tick a clock. Alarm raise, 2 out of 4 segments filled, to show things getting closer to a bad outcome. These clocks are often visible to players, creating a shared awareness of rising tension. It's a great way to make what was traditionally hidden game master bookkeeping, like how close are the guards to finding the intruders, an open part of the game that players can strategize around. As one summary put it, in Blades both position and effect can be short-term or affect a clock that the game master or player has created. The fact that even players can create a clock with game master approval, if it makes sense, let's make a clock for sabotaging the watchtower, we'll fill it segment by segment as we do tasks, demonstrates the collaborative ethos. It's shared storytelling in the guise of a tactical game. Blades in the Dark also encourages players to contribute to the narrative via mechanics like devil's bargains. Anyone at the table, not just the game master, can propose a devil's bargain when a player is about to roll. I'll give you an extra die if you accept X complication happens, regardless of the roll. For instance, I'll give you +1 die to your lockpicking roll if we say that regardless of success, you drop a calling card that the bluecoats will find later. If the player accepts, that twist will occur no matter what. Devil's bargains are a genius way of letting players opt into complicating the story themselves. Say that would be an interesting complication, sure, I'll take it. And even letting other players or the game master pitch cool narrative ideas that aren't strictly dictated by failure. It blurs the line of who can introduce story elements. Effectively, any participant can through this mechanic, but the player whose action it is gets the final say to accept the bargain or not. All of these modern mechanics, whether empowered by the Apocalypse or Blades or other new school games, serve to dethrone the Game Master as the sole author and instead make the Game Master a facilitator and adjudicator of collective storytelling. The Game Master still has authority, yes, but it's a curated authority. For example, in Blades, the Game Master still has final say on what consequences occur or whether a devil's bargain is valid. And in Apocalypse World, the MC is the one who interprets what a 7 to 9 or a miss result means in the fiction. However, the process by which the story moves forward is transparent and involves input from everyone. This has shifted the expectations at many gaming tables. These days, it's common for players to ask the GM, hey, what if in the story we try it this way? Or for a GM to turn to the players and say, what do you think would be a cool result here? Something that would have been unusual in a strict old school game. Another area of change in the 2010s is the adoption of conversation tools and social contract practices that formally empower players regarding the game's content. Concepts like the X card, a simple index card players can tap to edit out any content that makes them uncomfortable, were introduced around 2012 and quickly spread through conventions and home games. Likewise, Lines and Veils, an idea originated on the Forge by Ron Edwards and further popularized by games like Sex and Sorcery and Monster Hearts, let players and game masters set lines. These are hard limits on content, and veils, things that can happen but won't be described. A fade to black, if you will. Some games include these in their rulebooks now. For example, the Horror Game Trophy explicitly mentions that its instructions provide guidance for maintaining players' consent during play. The mere fact that player consent is discussed in a rulebook is telling. It assumes the players have a right to veto or alter the narrative for personal comfort. In earlier decades, such concerns were often not voiced, and if a game master introduced a distressing element, players either had to live with it or privately talk to the game master. Now with tools like script change, the power dynamics are more even. Any player can say, pause, let's adjust that story element, and it's understood that this is okay. Well, at some tables anyway. Game masters are expected to abide by these boundaries and even help enforce them. This trend reflects a broader shift toward collaborative social contracts. The game isn't Game Master versus players or Game Master above players, it's Game Master with players as equal human participants, each with a stake in making sure the game is both fun and safe for everyone. Even Dungeons & Dragons, still the 800-pound gorilla of RPGs, has not been immune to these trends. D&D 5th edition from 2014 significantly softened the tone from earlier editions, which were sometimes adversarial. The 5e Dungeon Master's Guide encourages DMs to say yes to player ideas and to focus on shared storytelling. It introduced bonds, ideals, and flaws for player characters, which, while not as dynamically tied to the plot as Burning Wheel's beliefs, at least nod towards involving character motivations in the story. The advantage-disadvantage mechanic in 5e is a simple player-facing rule that DMs often use to reward clever ideas or role-playing, a far cry from the rigid modifiers of earlier editions. Wizards of the Coast even published an official adventure, Icewind Dale, Rime of the Frost Maiden, in 2020, with suggestions for using the X card and other conversation tools, showing how mainstream the concept has become. Meanwhile, Paizo's Pathfinder 2nd Edition, another traditionally crunchy Game Master-led game, introduced the idea of secret checks to remove meta-knowledge from players, but also heavily emphasize Session 0 discussions and player input on the kind of campaign they want. It's also worth mentioning the influence of actual play shows like Critical Role and Dimension 20 on expectations. These shows depict game masters more as entertainers and facilitators, and players as co-storytellers performing for an audience. Many new gamers have learned from these shows and come to their own tables with an expectation that the game master will listen to player ideas and create a story with them, not against them. Matt Mercer of Critical Role, for example, often collaborates with players to weave their backstory elements into the plot and is transparent about adjusting the narrative based on character decisions. This doesn't mean the game is devoid of surprise for the players, but it does mean the players feel their creative fingerprints on the tale being told. The result is that even in games like D&D or Pathfinder, you find groups using techniques pioneered in indie games. Flashbacks, a Blade in the Dark staple, to let players add things retroactively to the story. Collaborative world building, asking players to describe a detail of a town they visit, a technique found in Dungeon World and 13th Age, and many others. By 2020, the concept of Game Master as a facilitator first and foremost had gained broad acceptance. Conventions and online forums often discuss Game Master best practices in terms of guiding a collaborative story, being flexible, focusing on player agency, and using tools to ensure everyone's having the experience that they want. We've come a long way from Gygax's dictatorial, if poetic, pronouncement of the Game Master shaping the cosmos and players staying within the bounds the GM sets. Now, it's often said that the bounds of the story are set by the whole group. The Game Master's power is still there, but it's tempered by agreed principles, whether those are written into the game's rules or simply discussed among the group. We discussed Fiasco as a game masterless game. It's worth noting a few others that use clever methods to distribute game master duties. Microscope by Ben Robbins lets players create an epic history together by taking turns establishing facts, essentially making each player a game master on their turn. Fall of Magic uses a scroll with prompts that players collaboratively interpret, passing narrative focus around. These games need no single authority because they provide structured prompts or scene-setting rules. They demonstrate that with the right framework, players can collectively handle pacing, world building, and conflict resolution. In a sense, the game design itself becomes the game master. While such games haven't replaced traditional game mastered games, they have influenced even game mastered play. Many game masters borrow techniques from these sorts of game masterless games. For example, using microscope-style collaborative map drawing for a session 0, or fiasco-like relationships between characters to give players more authorship. Beyond formal rules, there's been an evolution in the philosophies of play and the unwritten social contracts around the table. Earlier, the social contract might have been Game Master prepares world, players show up to play their characters, everyone tries to follow the rules and have fun. Now, groups often have a more detailed understanding. We explicitly agree on tone, on how much narrative control players have, on whether we're okay with the game master springing big twists or if we prefer to telegraph them, those sorts of things. Session 0, an initial meeting to discuss these expectations and build some of the world characters together, is a normalized practice. This idea was present in the past. Smart game masters always talk to their players about campaign ideas, but it's far more codified now. Many game books advise a session 0 as essential. During the session, the group might use the same page tool, a series of questions about play style and preferences, or discuss lines and veils, or collectively create the game's setting. For example, the group map, drawing in the Quiet Year, or Beyond the Wall RPG, those sorts of games. This upfront agreement forms a shared vision that gives players more involvement from the get-go. It's implicitly understood then that the Game Master's role is to uphold that vision, not to unilaterally change it because I'm the Game Master and I say so. All these changes are supported by the broader community discourse. Podcasts, blogs, and videos about game mastering now routinely emphasize listening to your players, improvising with player input, ensuring everyone's comfortable, etc. The archetype of the game master has shifted from the old all-powerful dungeon master behind a screen of secrets to something more like a game moderator or story guide. The journey from the game master as a solitary storyteller to a game master as a collaborative facilitator reflects the RPG hobby's continual push towards more player empowerment and shared creativity. What does this trajectory suggest about the future of game mastering and player agency? First, it seems clear that the days of the autocratic, always right game master are largely behind us, at least in most circles. Modern players have tasted agency and they're unlikely to give it up. The positive reception of games that foreground player narrative control indicates that future RPG designs will keep exploring that space. We're likely to see even more hybrid systems that blend strong game mastering frameworks with player narrative rights. For example, future versions of big games might include mechanics akin to Powered by the Apocalypse moves or Fate-style compels as optional modules, further normalizing the idea that players can dictate story elements. Even now, D&D adventures are being written with more branching paths and advice like, if the players don't take this hook, that's okay, here's how to adapt. An implicit nod to player-driven pacing. We can also expect game masterless or game master light games to grow. As role-playing diversifies with more people coming from board games or video games, there's interest in experiences that don't require one dedicated individual to do hours of prep. The success of solo RPGs and journaling games recently is an offshoot of this. People enjoy narrative play without needing a game master at all. In group settings, we might see more games where the game master role rotates or is shared. After all, if everyone is a co-author, why not let everyone have a turn setting scenes or portraying the environment? This is already done in some indie LARPs and freeform games. The future might bring technology-assisted game mastering too, perhaps an AI or app that handles the referee duty so all humans at the table are effectively players. We're already seeing early experiments with AI DMs in online gaming, though it's a long way from replacing the creativity of a live GM. Another trend likely to continue is the emphasis on consent and customization. RPGs are becoming more and more about tailoring the experience to the group's tastes. The next generation of game masters will probably be even more trained in session zero techniques, calibrations, and open communication. The social aspect, ensuring everyone is having fun their way, will be as important as the rules knowledge or the story crafting. This suggests the power dynamic between game master and players will keep leveling out. The game master might still have a leadership role, but it will be exercised with the group's explicit endorsement and continual feedback. Mechanically, we'll likely see innovations that further blur the line between game master and player duties. Perhaps more games will allow players to control aspects of the world. One player might always describe weather and scenery, another might handle NPC reactions in crowds, that sort of thing, as a shared responsibility model. We see prototypes of some of this in some indie games where players temporarily take on game master-like roles. For example, in Dialect, each player shepherds certain aspects of a culture. The future could normalize that, making GM more of a role that flows around the table rather than a fixed person for a whole campaign. That said, the traditional game master role is not going extinct. There will always be a place for a skilled game master weaving a story and surprising the players. But even in those traditional setups, the lessons of the last decades will likely hold, or be rejected entirely. Successful game masters will be those who collaborate and adapt rather than dictate. They will act less like author gods and more like curators of a group experience. As many designers have stressed, an RPG's enjoyment comes from players having meaningful impact. The thrill of seeing your choices shape events. Future game masters might embrace that principle fully, perhaps even more than today. We might even see procedurally generated plot tools becoming common in tabletop, where a game master enters some parameters and the system spits out a complex situation, and the game master and players together explore that. In all these cases, the game master's role is facilitator and interpreter, not puppet master. The trajectory from the 1970s to today shows a clear arc from centralized authority to distributed authority in storytelling. The game master will always have a special role, coordinating the game and often portraying the world's many facets, but that role is no longer about power over players, it's about empowering players. The evolution of game master authority is essentially a move towards equality and partnership in creativity. The best games, present and future, find that sweet spot where the game master's vision and the player's vision merge into one awesome, unpredictable story. Or maybe a place where no one really has a vision at all and we play the story as it unfolds. The role of Game Master isn't fixed, it's flexible, evolving with the systems we play, the stories we tell, and the people we gather around the table. Whether you prefer to run an intricate pre-plotted saga or co-create a wild narrative on the fly, the key is clarity and shared creative purpose. Understanding how Game Master authority has changed helps us become better facilitators, better players, and ultimately better collaborators in the shared act of storytelling. So whether you're behind the screen or in front of it, remember, it's not just about power, it's about partnership. If you've got thoughts on your favorite game mastering style or a story about when it went gloriously off the rails, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And of course, if you found this interesting, give it a like, share it with your gaming group, and subscribe for more deep dives like this one. And as always, thanks for watching. See you next time.